Mari, could you skip the recording? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So as you all just heard, we're recording this meeting, so I wanted to make sure you're aware of that. Happy to welcome all of you to our first task force meeting for our Employment Data Task Force. And I just want to start by thanking all of you, both those of you who are serving on the task force. We're really grateful that you're sharing your expertise with us and helping us do this work well. And for those of you who are listening in, who aren't formal members of the task force, we're also glad you're here and really welcome you. And we want to do this work together with you. So just a few process notes before we get started. So for the task force members, wherever possible, please unmute yourself and speak your comments. If you type a comment into the chat, we'll try to pause periodically to read the chat comments aloud, but especially in a larger group like we are today, sometimes those chat comments can quickly disappear. So for task force members, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak. For members of the community, you're invited to submit public comment in advance of the meetings to our office, and we have the email address here, info@c2c.ca.gov. And you can also make comments via chat during the meeting. Just to clarify, this is a task force meeting that our office is convening, so it's not subject to bag leaking like our formal board meetings are, which is why we're doing the public comment a bit differently. So feel free to engage in those ways. And then a quick note, so many thanks to our team who are renaming the task force members' names here within Zoom with an A colon that just helps the automatic alphabetizing that Zoom does easily identify our task force members so that people know. So I just wanted to share those process points to start. And then next I wanted to kind of outline the big picture goals for today's meeting. And before I walk through these points, I just want to take a step back and mention, our office has now officially launched. We're here. We're really hoping to build on the work that many of you did during the planning process. And so this task force is an example of something that was begun, the work was begun during the planning process, but there were still some unanswered questions. And so that's why we've, let me just pause for a moment. Can we mute? Thank you. Okay, that's why we've asked West Ed, who are still working with us, especially during the early startup period of Cradle-to-Career, to facilitate these conversations, because Kathy and her colleagues facilitated the conversations during the planning process that led up to where we are today on these conversations. So I've asked Kathy to continue to facilitate these task forces and help us move forward. So what are we trying to get done in today's meeting? So the first is to provide an overview of what this task force's responsibilities are and how that relates to the Cradle-to-Career governance structure and the work products that we're going to be moving ahead. And we're going to describe the work and the recommendations that came out of the planning process related to these data definitions, and then clarify the topics for this meeting and the upcoming meetings, including some expectations for preparation and follow-up activities so that we can all come to a shared understanding of what we need to accomplish with this time-limited task force. We'll review topics related to preparing the base wage file for the calculations that will go into a number of products that we put out, including dashboards. And we'd like to identify policies that might be impacted by adopting a uniform approach to preparing that base wage file for calculations in the Cradle-to-Career system. So these are the overarching goals for today's meeting. And now let's talk about the work of the task force overall. So the purpose of this task force, which is time limited and focused on this summer, is to provide input to our office at Cradle-to-Career for consideration in the development of the Cradle-to-Career analytical data set. That's the research data set that provides the foundation for the multiple things that we're producing, including dashboards and query builder tools. So you're providing input to us as an office for our consideration as we develop this. And our main goal for this task force is to recommend ways to consistently calculate employment and earnings data points from the unemployment insurance source data that the Employment Development Department, or EDD, is providing to us. So EDD is one of our data providers. They'll be providing this unemployment insurance information, and this is relevant for a few of the things that we're putting out early on. So one are the dashboards on teacher training and retention, the dashboard on student pathways, and the dashboard on employment outcomes. And then second is the query builder tool. So as envisioned in the planning process, we're planning to create a query builder that draws from that research data set and allows the public to kind of pull in different data points and learn from them in an aggregated and anonymized way. So that overall, that's the work of the task force. I realize I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, so I'll do that now. My name is Marianne Bates. I'm the executive director of Cradle-to-Career. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kathy Booth, who, as I mentioned, spearheaded the planning process that preceded the establishment of our office and is continuing to work with us. And I've asked her to facilitate this task force. So over to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Marianne. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we're doing to operationalize the ideas that Marianne laid out. So some of you participated in an earlier subcommittee of the planning process that was called the Data Definition Subcommittee. And that subcommittee was made up primarily of data experts in each of the agencies that are going to be providing data into the Cradle-to-Career system. And the goal was to figure out how it was we're going to document the data points that are going to be collected in the system. So one of the things that's different about how California is putting together its data system compared to other states is rather than creating a file template and asking all the agencies to conform their data to that template, all the information is going to be poured in its native format into web repositories or online repositories. And then in essence, there's going to be this massive Rosetta Stone process by which we transform the raw data into a format that aligns definitional possibilities across the different entities. So let's talk about why we made that decision to do it. And I think race and ethnicity is a really good exemplar for that. So we all know here in California that we've got this broad category called Asian, which is insufficient for what we need to do to understand very different communities that live underneath that umbrella. But unfortunately, each of our higher ed segments has developed its own list for subcategories that fit under Asian, some of which are the same, like you might find the category of Hmong appearing in multiple different lists, but not all the lists are the same. So by having everybody put their data in its native format, we've got some more flexibility so that if someone was doing a data request and they wanted to look specifically at the Hmong community in the Central Valley, and all of the data providers that they need information from have that category, we could actually pull it in to make the data more useful. The other thing that we were trying to do was address something that we were hearing from other states that was important for the development of their data systems. So we all know that documentation in general is something that organizations don't do particularly well. And this is true even in the case of something that you think would have a lot of documentation like data definitions. So there's all sorts of efforts like EdFi that are running around the country, trying to figure out a way to get more consistent about the way we understand the creation of a metric. So a good example from this in our planning process had to do with the concept of being economically disadvantaged. And when we really looked at how our K-12 entity, the California Department of Education, constructed that concept compared to how, say, the community colleges did, they had really different methodologies. Community colleges were looking at whether you were getting various types of financial aid, but CDE was looking at other factors like parental education level. So we realized we had to pull those apart and say, these are two different measures. They may get at a similar concept, but they're not the same thing. We shouldn't confuse them. So that's why we really started focusing on coming up with these definitions as early as possible, because that made it easier for us to make decisions about which data points really belonged in the data system and if there needed to be any constraints on their use. And this has to do with the vision for Cradle-to-Career, which is the idea that this is the source of reliable information. So it's true, our state agencies collect a lot of data, but sometimes those data points are not in the best shape because there aren't a lot of quality controls that are put in place for them because they're nice to haves. It might be that that data point is brand new and there's a realization it may take a year or two for it to get sorted out. And so when we did all this review in advance, it left everyone clearer that the data was going to serve the purpose that was intended. So that was a very long preamble to get you focused on what's specifically on this slide. So if those were our goals, our process was to have each one of the agencies fill out a template like what you're seeing on the screen that basically identified a concept. So we'd say, okay, what is your metric for economically disadvantaged? And you'll see here that the types of things that people were putting in were, did they collect it? What do they call it? Where does the information come from? Because of course, self-reported data might be treated differently than data that's coming from like an administrative data source. The way the data is formatted, the field length, the code values, the format examples, when the information gets collected, how many years are available. This was really important when we were trying to figure out the earliest date that could happen in the data system, and then an assessment about the quality of the data. So all told, I don't know, I think we had 15 agencies that were involved in the planning process, which identified 200 data points. We did this for all 200 data points. However, we had some issues that came up when we got to employment and earnings. So the ways that we were calculating information specific to employment and earnings is that our 3 public post-secondary segments, all of whom produce some sort of public documentation related to employment and earnings, describe to us how they calculate 3 measures: whether an individual is employed, how much money they are making, and whether they are getting to a living wage. And in addition to that, EDD, which is the holder of our unemployment insurance wage file, gave us information about how they go about calculating employment, calculating earnings, industry of employment, location of employment, and quarter of employment. And in that, they provided a lot more documentation about what's happening as that information comes in. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, not for our experts, but for members of the public, this information is reported up by employers to the unemployment insurance entity for the purpose of saying that if we had, I don't know, a global pandemic and suddenly a lot of people needed unemployment insurance, how much money would the state be on the hook for? So this is not a data source that is ideal for calculating, earnings outcomes for educational systems, but it's sort of the gold standard that are used in most states. So we were really looking at all the various factors that go into this. And what we discovered is that there was not any uniformity between how these 4 different entities were working with the data files. And so as a result, we didn't finish clarifying these definitions during the planning process. And instead, the thought was that we needed to get some experts together to think about this a little bit more. So first of all, we got together a task force. We had these little groups we called homework teams during the planning process, very similar to what a task force is now. They just met and they just really dug into the specifics. And out of this, they came up with a set of recommendations, which I'm realizing are very teeny tiny font on the screen. All this is also available from the planning documentation. But basically what they said was, everybody had done the best they could in figuring out how to work with the base wage file in order to calculate employment earnings, living wages, earnings gains, things like that. But that what we should be doing is having a group of experts get together and say, what is the right way to do this for Cradle to Career? So there's the technical aspect to this, but there's also the political aspect to this, because all 3 segments have done an incredible job with transparency of sharing information to the public about the employment outcomes of their students, how much money you can be expected to make, starting out with the community colleges doing Salary Surfer, where you could really go in and take a look by particular program of study and look at outcomes. Cal State Pays, which is a consortium that some of the CSUs is putting information in a much more attractive graphical interface. UC has been putting information out about this. So we have all these entities that already have a presence on the web that clarifies economic outcomes. And when we start to futz with what do you do with the underlying data set and do you want to change the calculations, it will create different numbers than what is appearing in those data sets. So as we go about thinking about what will be appropriate for Cradle to Career, which will have several dashboards that have employment outcomes, we also want to be thinking about the implications for the dashboards that exist with the segments. So that gives you sort of the context for the work that we have done. So I want to pause for a second before I go into the meeting topics and ask if there's just any questions you have about the use of employment and earnings data in the Cradle to Career system or anything else about the process. Jeff, it looks like you're talking, but you need to unmute yourself.
That is helpful. My quick question on the aim on the dashboard for student pathways, are there additional data that's coming in here, or are these data that you aim to use on the dashboard with student pathways, and how would you use it?
So there's several different dashboards that were identified during the planning process. So the pathway dashboard is going to be a Sankey diagram. So in essence, you're seeing how far different groups of people are getting in their education, like how many people are peeling off after high school, how many are making it to the bachelor's degree. And the idea is that you would have some measures in there for when those individuals entered employment and when they got to a living wage. And that would help us just begin to understand a little bit more the relationship between education and work. And that Sankey diagram could be disaggregated. So you could say, well, is this different based on different races or ethnicities? Is this different based on different geographic regions? So there is on the Cradle-to-Career website a place in the tools section where you can see a write-up of exactly what each of the dashboards is going to be. And it includes in there what the expectation is for what actions people could take based on the information made available. So that's the pathway diagram. The other two places where we're hoping to have some employment and earnings data, there'll be one that is just employment and earnings outcomes in general, looking post-education. And then for the teacher credentialing dashboard, there's a real interest in understanding for those who leave public education, where do they end up working? And is there a real differential in their earnings, which can help us address this question of whether it's just not feasible to live in an expensive place and be a teacher.
I have some questions. This is Rick Moore. I'm just catching up. Will the dashboards include outcomes for like high school dropouts, high school graduates, etc.? Is it just for the higher ed or lower levels too? Our
challenge is going to be our ability to match the data for folks that don't go on to post-secondary. So yeah. So basically EDD matches based on social security number, and our K-12 entities are prohibited by law from gathering social security numbers. So one of the things that will be important about this data system is that we're using a master data management approach, which means we're bringing in, for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, if you can just imagine like fuzzy matching, where you're like looking at various variables, names, date of birth, and things like that. But it's with a computer, so the algorithm is so much more sophisticated. So we bring together as many data points as possible so we can identify who the same person is, and we can fill in for missing elements. So it might be that we'll be able to find social security numbers somewhere else related to that person's record, related to other sources of information, like if they received various types of social services or if they were in an apprenticeship program or things like that.
Okay. So will there be dashboards for high school dropouts, high school graduates only?
There will be the ability to sort by education level in some of the dashboards.
But I won't be able to look up, I live in Santa Monica. I can't look up Santa Monica High School and find the outcomes for that institution.
I don't know that that would be feasible because of the fact that we will probably be missing social security numbers.
Okay.
In other states, that's been resolved by matching files through other agencies like the Department of Motor Vehicles. So maybe in the future.
And will this system include outcomes for non-degree training, like that would happen under workforce investment or ETP or anything like that?
So there's a 5-year plan for scaling out the data system. And the idea was that workforce training information should be included in the final, like as we're getting out to years 4 and 5. So there's already been conversations with the folks at EDD. They have an amazing data set that goes under the acronym of CalSkills. So figuring out how these things can relate to each other, which actually is a really important point. I want to clarify that what Cradle-to-Career is building does not preempt anything that has been built by any of the segments individually. So Cal State Pays has its own purpose, its own use case. The idea is to be in harmony with other resources like that to augment information, but not to supplant. And the same would be true for CalSkills.
We would be happy to go out of business. We're just in business because there wasn't anything. So another question. So there will be outcome measures for non-degree training programs. Another question, has there been any discussion of using the UI claims file to measure employment and unemployment and costs of unemployment?
Not yet.
Because we've used that extensively in the past, and it's a really good measure for training programs. But we haven't discussed that. Okay, is that in the scope or out of the scope?
So what I'm going to
sources.
Yeah, what I'm going to request for this set of meetings is we stay laser focused on the UI wage file, because we got to get to the point of having definitions. However, you should feel free to raise other possibilities like that. My colleague Beth Hart is taking detailed notes through all of this. One of the things that we anticipate is once the system is actually built, we'll be looking at refinements, ways to bring in additional data sources, and that's a great thing for consideration down the road.
Okay, and this is old information, but is there still an exchange in DC of base wage file records among the states?
That would be Swiss.
Jeff says that still exists.
Swiss does exist. We looked to see, because California is finally going to be a co-signatory,
That's great.
but it is not allowed to be pulled into data sets like this because you have to have a very, very specific research question. And this is too broad-based.
Okay, so we still won't be able to follow people out of state.
Right. So everyone in Lake Tahoe is going to be really sad about the fact that they can't look at who's working at Tesla.
Well, we're lucky we don't have big cities on the state border, so. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. Those
absolutely.
Yeah.
Brianna, I see you have a question.
Yeah, thanks for the orientation so far. I was just wondering if it might be possible to drop the link to, you mentioned there's a website that has what the dashboards are going to have in there and what the use cases are. That'll be helpful.
Yes.
And thank you.
I can absolutely do that. All right. So any other questions from our task force members? If there are questions from members of the public, go ahead and put them in chat, please. All right. And Beth, do you mind pulling the link for, it's under the tools tab of the C2C website. Oh, Marianne's done it already.
Just
There
dropped
you
it
go.
in.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that'll give you a list of all of what those dashboards are going to be. Although I don't know that it includes the teacher dashboard because that just is getting kicked up. There's actually a task force running simultaneously to this one where we're going to be fleshing out the specific questions for it.
Yeah, I'll drop some information on that in the chat as well.
Great. All right. So then, oh, I do see a question. Will a recording of the meeting be available to the public? Yes. So the recording for this meeting and the notes, supplementary materials are all going to be posted on the Cradle-to-Career website on the Get Involved tab. Our goal really, we had such an unexpected benefit of the pandemic was we were able to do more than 100 public meetings during the planning process. We want to keep that open exchange going with members of the public. All right, so let's start digging in and looking at the way we're going to parse the questions that were listed for the purview of this task force. So the first today, we just want to make sure that you're all really clear about what we're trying to do here. And then we want to talk about the base file itself. What do we do with that file when we receive it before we start performing calculations on it? Next meeting on the 22nd, we're going to be focusing on cohorts, basically who gets included. So a really good example is, are we going to include people who maybe went to college but didn't graduate compared to those who did graduate? So this is very relevant in contexts like community colleges that have a fair number of people that are referred to as skills builders that come and take 1 or 2 classes to do upskilling over time. And the community colleges chancellor's office has been able to demonstrate some really sizable wage gains for that population. So we should be thinking about how you think about who gets included in the cohort. Let's see. Oh, I do have the dates wrong. I apologize for that. The 4th meeting, I will have to go look in a different document because I don't have that at my fingertips. Actually, Marianne, if you could grab the 4th meeting, that would be great. So we'll do the cohorts. We'll also look at timing. So the question is, when after a student exited or graduated, do you start capturing their earnings information? So there are some instances that we know where people are focusing on a particular quarter. That's true in WIOA. We know that for some of the work being done by the Census Bureau, they're looking at calendar years because they're pulling from tax records that are calendar year based. So we want to figure out those timing questions. And then in our 3rd meeting, we're going to be talking about calculating employment, earnings, and earnings gains, which are the major metrics that are going to show up in there. And then finally, we'll look at living wage attainment and how we would do testing of the data as our final topics. And we'll talk a little bit more about those a little further on in the meeting. All right, so let's start talking about the consideration for the base wage file. So when we were in the planning process, and we were talking through the folks who actually get a hold of this file and then figure out how to make sense of it, there was a number of things that came up that people tended to start to manipulate in the base wage file, and the feeling was we should probably be pretty clear about this. So I've got a list of some of those topics that were brainstormed during that meeting, and I want to talk a little bit about the questions that we'll be digging into. But if there are other topics that you think are really important about the way you look at the records that are within the file, now is the time for us to start naming these things. So I'm going to stop being the one talking, and I'm going to really encourage all of you to either be writing in chat or unmuting and sharing with us your thoughts. So basically, one of the things I want to acknowledge is that you all are smart and experienced, but we don't want this to be sort of a throwing darts at a dartboard experience. So we want to think through what is the best way to answer these questions. Are there other people we should be talking to? Is there information that we need to gather? Are there general guidance and guidelines we want to create that would make it clear for the staff at C2C what they're supposed to be doing? And also, are there any other items that we want to address? So some of the topics that got brainstormed were, how do we deal with null records? Are those zeros? Like how do we want to handle those? A second is that sometimes the numbers just did not seem credible. Like it felt really impossible that somebody could have made that much money. And it felt like maybe there was an extra zero. So sometimes there was this feeling, should we sort of like strip a digit if the numbers seem too high? Other things that came up is maybe it's better just to strip the top 1% of records because they're anomalies that can really distort your general trends when you're doing things.
Hey, Kathy,
yes.
Very quickly, what is the size of these as problems as a percent of the data that you're looking about? So what's significant, what isn't significant in real terms, magnitude of order?
Great question. Thank you for interrupting too, so that I'm not just talking. Please do that, others. We don't know. So one of the things that we're contending with is that the Office of C2C just got started with hiring. They've just signed the legal agreements. The data has yet to be shared. So this might be a place where what we want to do is make a recommendation that there be an analysis that get run on the base file to determine how prevalent these problems are. And I invite folks from EDD to weigh in. Oh, wait, Rick, go ahead.
I'll just weigh in on the problem of, there's two big issues. One is on data quality, is you have different problems in different populations. When we've studied low-income manufacturing workers with this data, we have tons of problems of multiple records on one social security number, because you can buy that social security number in MacArthur Park in LA. Whereas data for college students is pretty clean, and you don't have that so much. A lot of the outlying values at the high end generated by social security numbers comes from phony social security numbers that are used by like 1,000 workers. But you don't find that very seldom in our higher ed data set. So population matters. I would just, in terms of the null records, that is a symptom of a bigger question, which, especially if you're measuring annual earnings, is who is in the labor market in California in that period. So over the years, we have tried various defining who's in the labor market by the patterns of null records. If you're there quarter one, you're not there quarter two, but you're there quarter three, you're in. If you're there quarter one, but you're not present in quarters 2, 3, or 4, we would say you left the labor market. So also, we've defined labor market participation by combining earnings records with UI claims. Because if you have a UI claim, you are in the labor market. And you also, again, when you get into the less than college degree population, you have a lot of seasonality of employment. So you'll see people who have a null record the same quarter every year because of seasonality. So I would frame the question first, overarching, is who is considered found for the purpose of measurement? And then that leads you to the null record discussion.
So I think that for this case, because we're trying to look at all Californians that participated in any form of education, including those that maybe stopped at high school, didn't even go to high school, and then we're trying to understand the relationship of education to the changes in earnings, we probably would want to cut that group pretty large.
Well, our first solution is we set a figure, and if there's more than so many earning records in a quarter for a particular social security number, we throw that number out. Akhtar may remember, you were in on the discussion where we set this number, but we set it
Yes.
as high as any reasonable. Even if you were a studio musician in LA who worked all the time, you wouldn't have more than X employer records in a quarter. And if it exceeded that, then we tossed that social security number.
Yes, Rick, I agree. This is after. Yeah, we did come up with that number. That number was like 20.
Was it 20? I couldn't remember
Yeah.
the number.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we established shared terminology, because I would not say that somebody not in your records is not in the labor force. They're just not in the UI universe. And so I think that would be an extremely important distinction, because you don't have self-employed, if I'm correct, right? And you don't have the civil service, or you're missing those pieces, so that you're just restricted to the UI universe.
Right.
Right. Okay.
And that's a constraint on the whole analysis.
Right, but I just think as we move forward, having on some of these points, and we can deal with them maybe offline, which is shared terms that become important and frequently used.
We also use the term found and not found in lieu of being in or out of the labor market.
That's helpful. Brianna, you had your hand up. Do you want to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just if we're thinking about this as an exercise for planning research, like to better understand the answer to these questions, as Jeff was pointing out, like what percentage are zeros and that kind of thing. Maybe I need some clarification about the first one. Is it no records? Are you saying records that don't have any salary earnings information, or that there wasn't a record present for a quarter?
That's a really good distinction. I think that we're probably dealing with both scenarios.
For the first one, I was wondering, since we have folks from EDD on the call, like, what do we know about those records? Have we followed up with any of the employers to ask, like, what is this? Like, why is your data showing up null? Because that would be maybe a research thing if we haven't done that already.
So this is Kim Heacock from EDD. We received the records, the base wage file information from employers, and we do not, I mean, they provide us the information and we do not, from a tax perspective, do anything with that data. We accept it as the employer provided it, and we do not go back to the employer unless we have an audit or some other reason, such as an obstructed claim, unemployment or disability claim. We do not go back to the employer to ask about the records because there's no need. We collect it for unemployment, disability, and paid family leave benefit purposes. So we don't have a reason to go back to them unless it's related to a claim.
I see. Is that a possibility, or it's just not an interest for the agency?
We could look into it, but I know we've gone back and asked on other reporting requirements they've had, and we have not been very successful. We've talked about it before. In like the ag industry, there's issues because people are using the same social security number for multiple employees, and there's of course issues surrounding that about why they do that. And you know, they don't have probably the correct social security number, so if we went back to them, it probably wouldn't come back with anything helpful.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Sandra?
I just, thank you. I wanted to just echo Jeff's comment in that we need to make sure we understand the universe of our students, and our students are not limited to what's in the EDD wage files. So that's one piece. And then the other, I agree with the comment on we probably should study the size and scope of these files and the errors that are being generated to understand, or before we can set or commit to a number or a percentage or whatever it is you're hoping that we can agree to on this. I think we need to understand how big the variance is on each of these bullets to make a recommendation.
It makes good sense. So I actually want to go back to something that Jesse said. So Jesse was addressing this question of there being a missing value within a sequence. So to Brianna's earlier question, do you want to unmute Jesse and just share what you've experienced in that realm?
Sure. It's not uncommon in these data that for whatever reason, an employer will fail to file a record for a worker in a particular quarter. And if it's just a 1 quarter employment spell, there's nothing you can do about that. You don't know how to fix it. But sometimes you'll have the same worker working for the same employer in quarter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're not there in quarter 6, and then they're back in 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a pretty plausible inference that the worker was probably still there in quarter 6 as well, and we're just missing the record. And so for a lot of purposes, it's often useful to just fill in that missing record and kind of give them the average earnings of the quarter before and quarter after or something like that. It's not perfect at the individual level, but it probably will help get more accurate data at the aggregate level.
So I'm going to make a note of that for when we talk about how we calculate earnings later. So part of what I want to do is like begin to sort of sort things into buckets of what we want to do with the base file today, and then these topics will inform what we discuss for the 3rd meeting. Rick.
I guess maybe the point for this for now, is that there's null records and there's null records, and sometimes you can learn something about what the variety of the null record is. And so maybe we want to break apart that first question.
That makes great sense, especially to Sandra's point that if we're going to do some investigations, we need to have some clear senses of what we're looking for.
Two thoughts on that. One, again, I think the pattern of having earnings and not having earnings can be used to define who is found and included in the calculation and who's excluded from the calculation, because we don't believe they're in California or whatever. The other thing I feel strongly about, and I looked at one point, did a paper about 6 state systems. Inferring earnings is the road to hell in this business. A lot of states like throw out any earnings that are less than the minimum wage at full time, or infer earnings for zeros. And it's hard to do that with any accuracy. And I think the PR cost of that is vast.
Jesse?
Yeah, I think I agree that you want to be very judicious about how you do it, but I don't think the answer can possibly be that we won't do it at all, because everything we're doing is inferring earnings at some level if we want to look at earnings. If we're going to cap at the 99th percentile or something like that, that's drawing inferences. And so I think we want to be transparent about it and limit it, but that's, but I think we have to do it to some extent. I'd also say, I think that the idea that somebody is found and therefore we include them, or they're not found and therefore we don't, is one we're going to have to discuss, because for many purposes, not found is an outcome that we care about. And we realize that sometimes that might mean that they've left the state, but other times it might mean that they're not working. And I think for when you're talking about comparing programs, I would rather keep all of them in there and count them as zeros for many purposes than leave them out, because that could create real biases in how you're comparing programs if there are differences in employment rates.
That drives all the central tendency measures down dramatically, because you include a lot of false zeros.
And some real zeros. If you leave them out, you drive them up.
That's why we always look for a pattern and say, this person could plausibly be assumed to be present in California, and this person could plausibly be assumed to not be present, before we calculate the central tendencies.
Again, we're not going to resolve this now. I just think that's going to have to be a topic for discussion.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think, why I like Jesse's idea, I'm assuming that when you talked about testing, anything that you would try, you would look at how it impacts the data versus the native data to understand it. So that will help address these questions. And then by understanding magnitude of order of problem, you can also understand whether or not the solution itself is even worth it, right? It might be so marginal that even if it's a perfect solution, it's not really helping, or it helps a lot. So that I'm assuming that testing phase gets to this, right?
Yeah, but I do want to call out that there might be some testing that we want to do sooner rather than later, especially about the base file and manipulations that we might want to do about who's getting included or not included based on things like missing records or looking at duplications. So I want to make sure Brianna gets a chance to speak, and then I want to go back and I want to talk about that idea of how we could do the testing. So Brianna, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the one at the bottom, I'm just really curious about, like how widespread that is, what percentage of the records fall into that category. It's definitely, one that some advocacy groups have been worried about in terms of even offering this kind of information to systems from the wage record systems, because they're worried about, people getting charged with fraud and all that kind of stuff, or, benefits and that kind of thing. So I am like really super curious how much that affects the data. And if it's a really small percentage, then it makes sense. I think, we just don't count it. But yeah, so if we have the ability to look into that further.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So we could generate a list of questions. We could see if there's anything. We've already said that we want to split that first bullet point into both nulls in general and nulls for specific individuals within a sequence of related quarters. Where could we get this tested? Is that something that EDD could do? Is that something that one of you that is already holding data could do?
This is Akhtar from EDD, and I'm pretty sure we can do that in EDD. And so just send us the question, Kathy. But I understand actually but still actually, if you send me the questions, really what you want us to look into, yes, we can do that.
Fantastic, thank you.
Great.
I'm wondering also if any of you have done research on any of these topics that we could be referencing to help us inform these questions.
Actually, we have not done any. I just asked Mark Stockton. He is our expert. He is sitting on the panel also here. So we have not done, but we can look into. We can do that.
Great.
I don't have published work, but I could probably dig out some calculations we've done. I agree completely about testing the data, but the thing that you have to remember is that based on the demographics of the population you test, especially in terms of level of education, you're going to get completely different views of the problem. At the UC and CSU, we have few people with, 200 earnings records. We have many fewer problems. When we're dealing with low SES populations in employment and training programs, we have a major problem with that. And we also, in terms of, if you look at college graduates, they tend to be employed every quarter. You have very little of the in and out of the labor market going on. But if you look at ag workers or low wage manufacturing workers, you have a lot of in and out of the labor market and a lot of missing quarters. So in designing the test, I would recommend we look sort of program segment by program segment. If you're going to look at high school non-graduates, you're going to see very different problems than if you look at UC students.
So that's going to pose a problem for EDD because they don't have the educational attainment data, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. We can do only overall. Really, we cannot identify the groups. So until Rick, what you are saying, actually, you used to send us that, and we can do for you for specific, but not like the one we are talking about here.
Let me just say, many years ago, when Pat Johnston was still in the Senate, we developed a system like this for 9 programs, and it included the prisons and up through community college vocational. And each program, each of the 9 programs had its own sort of labor market profile in terms of what the issues with the records were. Whereas the head of prison data told me, you don't need a social security number to participate in our program. So we're going to have to think about this. Akhtar, we can talk offline, but we get some, like if you get the WIA population, you have that, and you take my CSU population, you compare these measures, you're going to find dramatic differences.
Jesse?
So we at the California Policy Lab have been working extensively with EDD on their files and are happy to kind of support analyses we want to do with this. I think we shouldn't think that the kind of goal of a kind of preliminary analysis of EDD data before we have this all linked is to get perfect estimates of what the rates will be for the particular population we're in. But I think we can get, it will be informative whether there are you know, 5% or 0.1% of the SSNs have 30 records in a quarter, even if that's not exactly what's going to correspond to what we'll see for our population, I think it still tells us how much, gives us a sense of how much we need to worry about some of these issues. And again, we're happy to work with EDD as much as they'd like us to help answer some of these.
So do you have the educational attainment levels linked in your set?
We don't have anything that they don't have. I think there's some information you can get for people who file UI claims, but really there's not much we can do.
But
Yeah.
like you've not linked to education and employment records, so you can't do that analysis either.
No.
Okay. So I'm curious.
Yes, they,
Oh, go ahead.
Kathy,
Yeah.
we provide them aggregated data. Actually, we have a couple of students, graduate students, hired through California Policy Lab. So they are our employees actually. So they have full access to the data, but they, so what he is saying, Jesse is saying, actually, we work very closely with CPL. So yeah, we can do it actually. Whatever the research you want us to do, like look into all these null values, zeros, whatever, send us, we can do that. We can do with the help of CPL or staff or us, actually. We have expertise to do that, no problem.
Thank you. So I want to pause for a moment and check in with Sandra and Jill, because it's going to be your students in the community colleges that are most likely to have variable records. I'm recalling on old versions of the launch board when we used to show quarterly earnings for particular programs of study and how prevalent it was that there would be missing records in those. Is there any analyses that you all have done that we could be looking at that might help us understand the prevalence of missing records or match rates or things like that?
I don't know of any recent, but I can find out from our research team if they've done anything specific recent, but to my knowledge, nothing recent, but we can go back and look at some of the older stuff. But I am concerned that the EDD data is very limited in terms of capturing what our students do. Many of our students are self-employed, and so it doesn't reflect everything that is happening within our system. And so that's why I'm curious at the size and scope of this, right? Of the records that you have and these bullets that you have listed here, like understanding the magnitude of that is important for those determinations. I don't know if Jill has any other insights.
To the first point question, Kathy, I can't recall having seen analysis on missing records, missing quarters for students. So just I agree with Sandra that I'm not familiar with anything that can be gathered from the community college side on research in that area.
I think there are two things that we probably could tap into. So I know that there are match rates listed in the launch board by program, to get to Rick's earlier point that you see very different outcomes in agricultural programs compared to some other disciplines. I would imagine you also would have information because of the adult education pipeline, where we could be looking at your non-credit students, which would be another major group where you're more likely to have low match rates. And there's also the CTE outcomes survey, where we could be looking at self-employment. While it's a sampling, it's a pretty strong survey related to response rates, and that might help us further quantify who might be missing and in what context. So maybe we could follow up and just identify if there's anything that's readily available from any of those sources that we could pull into this analysis to make sure we're not skipping over a really important part of the California population.
And to your point, Kathy, this is Jill. I don't want to volunteer anyone to do the work. We do have obviously those linked records within the system. So there is a possibility to, if it doesn't already exist, potentially to look at something, to look at this question.
So maybe what we can do is start to identify what the specific asks would be, and then the Office of C2C staff can coordinate with each segment to figure out what the best way is for doing the analysis. Oh, but Jeff, you've got your hand up. What were you going to say?
Oh, on the issue with the community college students and being self-employed for testing, not now, but much later in the game, you have secondary data, perhaps such as the scorecard. And I know it's got lots of problems and differences between your data, but you could do a comparison of, like, say, median earnings to understand how a link to Treasury compared to your linkage, what kind of differences you get. It's not for testing now, but it gets to a different type of testing that you might do, but
I would
way
be
down the lane.
really worried about using the college scorecard because they're relying on Pell data, and Pell uptake record levels are still pretty low for community colleges. I mean, it would be a good alternate source. And someone else had also put in the chat, you could use the American Community Survey. So that might be another way that we could just do a little bit of.
Well, it's the problem is the linkage to the community college program, so that you could do a couple of tests where you felt comfortable to understand whether or not the self-employment is causing a bias. Yeah. So, but anyways, that's down the lane. I
Okay.
wouldn't bother with it now.
Okay, but let's definitely think about so I think that we can use the ACS data. We could use the CTE outcomes survey. We could use the college scorecard. Are there any other places where earnings are being calculated or employment rates are being calculated that we could use as reference points?
We also have all the strong workforce in data in the launch board as well. So we could use that, but it does a comparison of CTE to non-CTE programs. So we could look at that as well.
That's great, thank you. Okay, so what I want to do is I just want to go down this list and have us refine the questions we'll then be asking our colleagues to take a look at. So I'm seeing that the first question we're going to break down to look at, so how would you want to frame this, especially those of you that have really dug into these questions? How would you reword bullet 1?
Who is found for analysis purposes and who is not?
I think we want to, I would phrase it as which people and which quarters do we want to treat as zeros versus exclude? And I think that's related to who's found, but I think there are multiple ways one might want to answer that.
And then I guess another part of that question, which is what should we do with records that don't have any information on wages? And is there a possibility to follow up with like 1 or 2 employers that have records like that to see what might be, just, exploring it, not like an audit. Like we see this in our data from a lot of places, what might be going on with you.
Any other questions you want to capture on bullet 1?
Maybe one question we could ask this group to weigh in on is whether there are any best practices or commonly used approaches to identifying who is in California and who isn't, and if that's something we want to consider in this first bullet point as well.
There's not really, I think, a great way to do it for the people who don't have earnings. That if they show up in another system that you have, maybe you can see that, but there's an awful lot who aren't going to show up in other systems, and we wouldn't have. And I think you just have to draw some inference and realize that there's going to be some error, whichever way you draw that inference.
Yeah, there has been some work, and this would get you on people who might be working in California but not show up, which I think it's John About or Haltwinger is doing work trying to really associate the address where the check is mailed, because you have the headquarter problem with UI. I'm not sure what kind of degree this exists in California, but so he's been doing a lot of work really trying to match where the paycheck goes to identify that the person, at least lives in and arguably works in. And so I'm not sure how much that the headquarter location problem you guys suffer with your UI, but he'd be somebody you might talk to.
Richard, is it Rick?
I'm sorry.
So Rick next has his hands up.
Oh,
you're on mute.
Can't unmute. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
The headquarters problem really limits regional analysis in California. again, this may be outside the scope of what was planned, but in our earlier project that did the 9 agencies, we got earnings data from the federal government, the post office, and the military. And if you can get those, you can sort of either integrate those earnings numbers, or you can declare these people employed but not in the earnings calculations. But if you frame the problem as finding where everyone ended up, you sort of go down that road rather than just measuring earnings. So I'll just flag that as a potential method.
Thank you. Brianna?
Yeah, maybe I just need to understand the question a little bit more. So are we trying to get at those people that aren't matched to find out information on them to see if they're employed because they might be employed outside of California? Or are we checking up on the people that we already have as matched to the EDD files and trying to determine if they actually live in California?
But I think our challenge is that what we have right now is the UI file.
Yeah.
Even though we wish we had more, that's what we got. So as I'm beginning to think through this, listening to all of you, what's sort of coming to mind is understanding the match rate. So the question of like, who's been found, what we have as our starting place is the cohort of individuals that are in each of the post-secondary segments. Eventually, we hope to also have K-12, but we don't right now. Eventually, we also hope to have workforce training, but we don't right now. So we could look at match rates for community colleges, CSU and UC. And that would give us a sense about sort of who's there and not there. We could go a step further and look at demographics. We could go a step further and look at programs of study if we wanted to be able to understand and characterize who's missing. I don't know, does that sound like a credible approach to answer this first question?
I guess I'm just wondering what other kind of data set. I know you want to focus on the wage system for this conversation, but it makes me wonder like what other data sets can be leveraged to tell that story. I don't know if you've already talked about the census data and that kind of thing and all the other states that are participating in census querying, but that would be like another, you know, at least in the aggregate, seeing like what percentage are in California versus other states, even if we don't have as granular data for that.
I think we're going to have to put that as something that would happen in a future state.
I see. Okay.
But I do think it's really worth us flagging it because that is, the Census Bureau is building a data set that looks across various sources that allows us to have a much deeper understanding of earnings. So I think that that would be worth listing as a priority for down the road.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at this with our data, like using IRS records to get some kind of understanding. So we would know that for the U system estimate a little bit. I don't know if other systems have done something similar. And even use LinkedIn data because we have a lot of international students that will not be in this file either, right? To try to get a sense of that. So I don't know if there are parallels for the other systems that they've been using.
Well, Rick, it sounds like you've been doing some analyses using these other sources like post office data, right?
That was a long time ago, but you know, we framed the problem in that project, finding out where everyone ended up. So we also looked if people were in prison, were people collecting, you know, social benefits, were people unemployed or collecting UI. So we looked, you know, we conceived it more broadly as outcomes because we were looking at some populations where like avoiding incarceration was a key goal of the program. So in Florida, when they were doing their early system, that was sort of their mantra, find where everyone ended up. And if we're just focused on earnings in California, I think we can do a lot with the base wage file. But we have to be careful about defining, as we keep talking about, who's excluded from the analysis. And what you'll find, because we used to get together and swap data with the UC and our colleagues in the community colleges, is you find community college students in state the most, CSU the next most, and UC the least. They're the most mobile. So that's what I mean. You get systematic differences as you look at different populations. And similarly, as you go into manufacturing workers, WIA participants, etc.
Jeff?
Maybe a suggestion to help move forward would be a way to segment these questions into those that are really critical to understand the degree of trust that you can have with the data, and those that are questions that really are necessary and fun research questions that could be moved to later, right? And so separating those out might help you move forward. And so to Jesse's point, you know, if 15% of something's missing, it's a problem. 0.1% is missing, okay, we're fine, you know, it's going to cause, and then other questions, and I think I think it was Brianna who was bringing up, you know, going and ask the employer. I think those are important research-oriented questions to understand why something happens, but things that are outside your bounds of fixing them. So you have to just do a test to understand the impact that it has. And so by doing that segmentation, you can move forward, and some of this you just have to throw your hands up and you got what you got.
So what I want to propose is that we'll write up a draft set of questions, and I will put that in a Google Doc that I'll share with members of the task force, so you all can swiftly go in and edit and amend each other's work for how we want to refine those questions. Is that something that would be feasible to do in the next couple of days?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sandra, we'd love to get to the franchise tax board data, but that was one bridge too far. We had to get 15 agencies to agree to participate. So we stopped at the 16
agency. Oh my goodness, that sounds horrible, but kudos to you for trying.
Kathy, on EDD side, let me say clearly that we can do, like, we can look at just randomly select few quarters out of last 10 years data, like 40 quarters, like 4 to 5 quarters, and look at overall values with $0 wages. So we can do that. That's the only thing we can do really. Overall by quarter, and then we can go with the overall number and the percentage also. So we can do like 4 to 5 quarters randomly selected out of last 40 quarters.
Okay.
That's what we can do in EDD, but others like community colleges, if they have matched data, they do not have on whatever when they send us to the social security number, they received only matched numbers. So they can look into what matched data they receive, and then they can do by group. Actually, whatever the grouping they have, they can look by group, but we can do only overall. So I just want to make it clear on EDD side.
That makes sense. So let me just double check about some of these other questions. Like, would it be possible to look at the number of times that multiple people, like we could do like groupings of how many people are on the same, or I'm sorry, I'm going to go backwards. You said earlier that there was a threshold of 20 employment records per quarter that you had set. So I guess
no, sometimes, yeah, let me say, actually, sometimes we have like one social security number is repeated multiple times.
Right.
And sometimes we finally like 40 times, repeated over 40 times. So, but what Rick was mentioning, then when we worked with him, so we agreed that, okay, if any record is found more than like multiple times, but we will keep up to 20 records, first top 20 records, and then we will delete the other 20 records. So we came up with that plan, actually. It is written, I don't know everything, but overall was that. But in this case, yes, once it is not like unique social security number is repeated only once. There are multiple times, and so we can look into that also.
So maybe we set a threshold, like how many people have more than 20 records. So if that was a number that seemed credible before, then we can just sort of check it and see if that still is sorting us out.
Yeah.
So then the next thing that this was, I remember someone was down at the individual level and seeing like 2 identical records for the same person in the same quarter, where the concern was that had been a like a data entry error. Do you have a sense for the prevalence of that kind of problem in the work that you've done?
2 identical records, actually, Mark, if you can talk about this, but really in our case, for same person. Mark, what do you say on this one? Are you there, Mark?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not sure. What are you asking? What do we do with it if there's a?
Well, so this was described anecdotally by a researcher. And so my question is, have you looked at the prevalence by which you see, like, how is it that Kathy Booth had two different employers that paid her exactly the same dollar value in the same fiscal quarter, which would imply, I know that a lot of payroll services do an automatic upload. You could imagine a data entry error. Is that something you've investigated related to
No.
data quality?
No.
I don't think so. We ever did actually, because yeah, Mark, you agree with me? We never did it, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that something that other people have stumbled across in your own research that made you concerned, or is that too hard to tell because you tend to work with aggregated data?
Yeah.
The last time we looked at it for, I think it was an ETP population, about 20% of workers had multiple employers in a quarter. And that can be for two reasons. One, they're multiple jobbing. They've got two part-time jobs or a regular job and a part-time job. Or if you change employers in a quarter, and people change jobs all the time, you generate two employer records in that quarter. So again, if it's under the threshold of 20 employers, we add the records together to get the quarterly earnings.
There's
certainly people who have multiple employers in a quarter that legitimately. I think the issue that as I understand what we're talking about is, what if we have two records for the same person, same employer, same amount of earnings in the same quarter? I've encountered that not in EDD's data, but in other similar data systems. And I usually assume that those are accidental duplicates because it's hard to imagine a legitimate circumstance where that could arise.
Yeah, we have never noticed, but we can look into that too, really. So we have never noticed this, like for the same employer, same quarter, same wages. Yes, multiple employers, like what Rick is mentioning. Yes, it could be one source security number can be repeated multiple times with different employers.
So what I'm seeing is a note from Matthew Case in the chat, who's saying that he raised this issue. I don't know, Matthew, do you want to unmute and just describe what you saw happening?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes.
So one thing to just put up front is we don't actually get an employer identifier. I'm with the CSU Chancellor's Office, so we don't have a way to, we just get a dollar amount and an SSN associated with an individual. And so, yeah, we were seeing, a non-trivial number of cases where it was the same exact dollar amount for that social in a given quarter. And when we asked about this, we didn't get like a detailed response, but it was sort of this issue of where information had updated for the employer. And so that employer, whatever ID on the back end that we don't see, what ended up inserting basically a duplicated record. So it was a database merging issue, as I understood it. And there could be more involved in that. And, there's only so much, the investigation that the data warehouse team can do on some of these things, but we're seeing enough of it. And when you're duplicating, straight up a record on a student, that can have implications in a quarter. And so it was just something that they advised us to go ahead and just do distinct on that dollar amount, but it's not, as a researcher, it's not like super satisfying to just like, yeah, that's probably a duplicate, but that's the best we could do, I think, without having that employer ID. So I think listening to some of this discussion, I think some of it is we have to be, at a certain point, get pretty specific about how you're going to do some of these data quality things. So, and what set of data you're going to be working from. So the set of data that I think at least UC and CSU have, I think are pretty comparable. We're not able to get access to UI claims. We were told we don't have need to know on that. So that may be different in this context, but UI claims would be very helpful, especially in light of what happened with the pandemic, right? And understanding who was actually employed. I don't know what sort of need to know C2C has on that. And I would say the same for the employer ID. employer ID, depending on what you might be able to know about it or incorporate it into your model, you could do a little bit better on some of these data quality pieces. But that was sort of the context around that concern.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on a list of questions that's going to go into a Google Doc. And then I both encourage those of you who are curious and want to do the detective work, like Brianna was mentioning in the chat, that you go ahead and ask your questions. And then EDD is going to help us determine whether that is actually feasible to get done. Because I understand that I'm letting them, the cats play in our collective playground of data. And even I am getting excited at the thought of what could get investigated. So EDD, do feel free to say what's feasible. All right. The second thing that I want to make sure that we cover before we run out of time is that in the discussions with our homework team, we were learning a lot about how EDD has to manage like the reprocessing data that comes in. So it could be that there is a problem and data get corrected from the employer. And this has to do with, in essence, with the continuity of the information in the C2C tools over time. So both of these bullet points, I'm going to cover them at the same time, are addressing the same issue. So maybe it's that an employer makes a correction and all of a sudden the numbers change. It may be that through our master data management solution, all of a sudden we get a social security number and we're filling in information for a group of students that is going to change your median or your average, whatever we choose to use as our calculation. So how important is it in these public facing tools? Remembering that this is dashboards, this will be a query builder where you can drag and drop variables to get summary tables. That is it better to just keep enriching the data set knowing that the numbers will change over time, or is it better to constrain it?
I would think that in the situation you're in, continued improved data is certainly very attractive. And I don't sure if you have the data facilities to store older versions, but then you just always be able to go back. So that might be an option, like once every 2 years, or have a 2-year-old version and then update, 2-year-old version, update. So you have an archivable proof of concept so that you could go back and check yourself, because that will be important. I know I make mistakes programming, so I assume you guys do. So that you'd want to be able to validate that changes in the data were the very reason that you had a difference in outcomes. So having an archived data might be the way to do that. Might.
Jill.
Just a question about this question, which is that was the concern that for the public facing tools that people would say see changing numbers and be concerned about the quality of the data, or is that the challenge that you're like what led to these?
Yeah, the problem that we create in making data more available is that more people who don't understand data construction and research methodologies will then be looking at numbers. So I'm sure we've all got experiences in our back pocket where you realize that you've made a calculation and there was an error, and then you go in and you fix it. And if it's in something that's public facing, everyone's like, well, why did that number change? And most people don't want to listen long enough for you to explain your nerdy methodology change that adjusted the figures.
I think I've had experience dealing with some of this in the past, and I think part of it is a socialization issue, and also like right sizing the comments about changes and updates to the audience. You don't have to, you can and should provide detailed, but not everyone, you provide it also in a way that is accessible to folks. And I think what I found in the past that once you do some of that work, it's not an issue necessarily as much as people might think it is.
For my knowledge, actually, not many data points get corrected. But Kim can talk. Kim, I think Kim, she is here. Kim, can you talk about that and actually how you handle that? I was told that it is very insignificant number actually get corrected every quarter.
Correct. It's not very many that get corrected.
Jeff.
When you said using average or median, it made me think to ask, A, are you also going to do variance like P25, P75, which is, I think, good information to give to people? And then secondly, a whole other type of data change, which is, do you have censoring criteria for number of people in a program, number of people in a cell, which could change with enrollment from one year to the other. So you have another type of problem that could be created, and that might be part of another conversation too.
So there are some suggested ways of displaying the information, like looking at various places in percentiles related to earnings. And that will get addressed when that dashboard is getting designed. So the idea is that we really want to be talking to members of the public about how is it that they would want to see information that would really be useful to them for the kinds of questions that they're asking. To your second question, there is a suppression protocol that was created during the planning process, which is more conservative than the one used by any of the data providers on their own. And so that protocol is available on the planning website. I'm happy to share it, but basically you have to have 30 people in the denominator for anything to show, which is going to mean that there's not going to be this is not going to be the place where you're going to say, I want to see the outcomes for the floral arranging program at Marin College, because it's going to be too small for people to see those results.
My point, though, is from one year to the next, if you would go from 29 to 30 enrollment, you're going to have a program pop in and pop out of your sample, which is the same thing as the changes to the record type of problem, but when you start to develop more time. And so I think you need to address that sort of in this same block is how the things change over a year on year.
It's an excellent point. Thank you. Sandra.
So I too have had a lot of experience with this in a not so great way. And so I want to emphasize the timing of changes. Sometimes we get kind of focused on accuracy and forget the purpose of why this data is important and how it's being used by whomever. And I'm thinking of my colleges and how we tie their vision to success goals to some of our launch board data. And so the timing of the changes is really important, because when we factor those into how we're creating metrics for accountability, changing it frequently creates chaos in the field. So making sure the timing is, I'm not going to hold you to this change in metric till next year, right? Because you're already halfway through to whatever you committed to doing. And I know that our system doesn't pivot that fast, but what it does do is creates chaos when you change things halfway. So not only, getting agreement on, how they're handled, but also the frequency of changes and when those get rolled out is super important to Jill's point about how we socialize these changes.
Thank you. Brianna?
Yeah, just leaving off on Sandra's last point, I think, whatever we decide to do here, obviously, footnoted or kind of described in the description of the data that changes could be made or they're not, whatever that decision is. One thing that I'm thinking about in our data, which we do update and changes, and so the median might change from like 75,000 to 76,000 or something like that. It's not a huge change at the aggregate level, but what I'm thinking about, and to Jeff's point, is like when we start looking at by program, and if there are going to be policy decisions made about types of programs or those kinds of things, or even by race or other kinds of demographics, there might be more shifting there if we're using something like the median and we're updating the data. I'm not sure, but my sense is that the further we disaggregate, the more this is going to be an issue.
Jeff?
Yes, I think it was to Sandra's point, I think publishing a schedule of changes once you get established will be great for the community.
Okay, so we are coming down in our last 10 minutes. So what I want to do is just name a little bit what we're going to be talking about. And so what I'd like you to think about, and you can answer, you can just like shoot an email to our team. I'll add this to the Google Doc that we'll be working on together. It's just, is there any information that we should be capturing in advance of our next meetings? that would help answer some of the questions. So in our next meeting in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about who to include in the calculations. We may not have all the information yet back from EDD, but we can talk at least conceptually about that. So like the question of, is it completers or anyone who's enrolled or anything like that? The time frame for the calculations, fiscal year, calendar year, wait 2 months after they've exited, you know, whatever, those types of issues. And then we will talk a little bit about what we've learned from the conversation that we had today. That's sort of what's expected. So is there any information that you think we should be looking at and bringing to the group, or that you would want to know before we talk more about cohorts and timing? And we are, by the way, pulling sort of a spreadsheet where we're looking at how these things are handled by national and state entities that we'll be sending out. I just wanted to make sure that I could show it to our post-secondary segments to make sure I didn't have any errors before we go forward. Brianna.
Sorry, this might have been already covered, but so are we looking at non-college goers, or are we only looking at folks that have been at any institution that we have here at the table?
So the thing is that in the beginning, it will probably have mostly data on college goers, but as we enrich our ability to do identity resolution, we'll be able to start pulling in other populations, is my expectation.
So it will be something in the future that we'll Okay, thanks.
Rick.
Critical database for us we can't work without is the National Clearinghouse in DC. So we can identify students who went on to other institutions and advanced degrees. And that also deals with the who's out of state for that period. So are we contemplating using that?
That was one of the recommendations from the planning group, was to include it. Veronica.
Hi, I have a question about the match between the UI records and the education data for college goers. Are you gonna use SSN only, or it's gonna be based on like, you know, IDs created either by the education side or the UI? Like I had experiences like matching on SSNs, also matching by IDs generated from the education side and matching with the IDs generated by UI. And the match rates are also different. So I just was wondering what ID you guys are going to use eventually for the matching.
It'll be just social security number. Basically, the file will be sent to EDD and they will do the match and send back a file that has the social security number removed.
I'm late to the party here, so maybe this has been provided, but once you merge these files together, it'd be nice to see what the data elements that you're going to have are. I think it would be very helpful to answer your questions. So we've got that universe, which I'm beginning to understand, or I guess universe, but then on what your records are. Is it just earnings and program, or any other elements that might be there will help answer some of the questions that you have here? And I don't have a sort of a pseudo data dictionary in front of me to even start to answer. It would help me keep in scope for answering these.
So there are 200 data points that'll be in the data set, and I will send you all a link to that. It's actually all posted on the C2C website, so you can see all the data points. But the ones
and does that also have the universe also? So that's going to, you can at least start off like the universe starts off as people who went to college and are found in the EDD data, something along those lines, or?
So for the entire data set, it will be anyone who was in any form of education that is captured by various state agencies. So we will have, for the earliest level, participants in state subsidized early learning and care programs, then K-12, then all the public post-secondary segments. We'll be bringing in the private colleges. We will be bringing in independent colleges. Hopefully we'll have stuff from other states from the clearinghouse. Then we'll look at participants from there in state-funded social service, healthcare programs, the workforce related programs like the WIOA programs, starting with apprenticeship, and that'll sort of build it out for the first 5 years, and then it may get extended beyond that after that.
Oh, so hence the name Cradle-to-Career, duh.
Yeah, but the employment and earnings related metrics that are slated are, is somebody employed? How much money are they making? Is there a change in earnings? Are they making a living wage? what industry are they employed in? And those were the metrics that in the end, everybody could agree to, that they thought was high enough quality related to it. Okay, so we are just about at time. So I just want to preview then in our third meeting, we're going to be looking at those calculations for employment, earnings gains, and thinking about the implications of those. We don't need to look at, industry of employment because that's just the NAICS code and we already have that defined. And then our final meeting, we're going to be looking at living wages, and then sort of, as you know, there's the MIT calculator. There's another one that comes out of the University of Washington that's used by the community colleges. We'll take a look at those. And then in that idea of, is it a living wage for an individual or a family? And if so, what kind of family and how many adults are working and those types of questions. And then we really do have this challenge that we can't use the UI file to determine where a person is employed. We spent a fair amount of time with EDD looking at this because so much of this gets reported from payroll services or corporate offices that those are not reliable numbers. So we're just going to be looking at our addresses. We're going to be looking a little bit about some of that methodology. So that's what we're going to be discussing. If you have ideas for ways that we could gather information in advance on any of these topics, please do send those to our team so that we can have that information available to go out to everybody. So this is the work that we have coming up ahead of us just in the last few minutes. I am going to be following up with our 4 data providers. There was information provided during the planning process that about how you do these calculations. I'm just going to have everybody double check that documentation to make sure that it's current. And then what we're going to start doing is doing write-ups based on our discussions, because your recommendations are going to go, of course, first to the Office of Cradle-to-Career, which will bring recommendations forward to the governing board so they know the work that was done. So I was maybe a little bit optimistic, thought we were going to be able to get the write-up about the base calculation done by the 21st. We're not going to do that because we're going to do some research first, which is a much better outcome. But in generally, this is our cadence, but we really have to get this all done by July 28 to prepare for our board meeting in August. All right, so again, next steps, we're going to have our segments confirm the data, and then I'm going to, rather than have you do the draft write-up, I'm actually going to send this out by tomorrow, a summary of the questions that we want to have asked for EDD to process for you to give input on, and just a couple of other prompts for other things that came up during the session. All right, so that is the end of what we have on the agenda. I do want to just note there was a comment from a participant who was concerned about people not having Social Security numbers. That is a real risk. I just want to acknowledge, and that's part of, I think, what our experts were discussing, is that there will be individuals where we don't have a valid Social Security number on file for them, and they will be missing from this data set, which is one of the reasons why we have to really explain who's there and who's not. But thank you for raising that. Any final thoughts before we close out? All right, well, thank you so much for your expertise. And Marianne, why don't you take us over the finish line?
No, I was just going to say, I just wanted to end with a huge thank you for all of your time, and special thanks to EDD for being willing to do some really helpful analysis between now and the next meeting. And the final thing I just wanted to mention is it's election day. So if you haven't yet voted, please do. You have a couple hours left. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.